Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the 34th Annual California Small Farm Conference. We're stoked to have you here in this incredibly important topic here. I think it can be a really great workshop. So if you're here looking for land conservation and equity, then you are in the right place. We got some wonderful panelists to multiple perspectives on the topic, so stay tuned. Just want to do a quick couple introductions and housekeeping. My name is Evan Wigg. I'm with Community Alliance of Family Farmers, and just wanted to give a big thanks to our presenters today, to all of you for attending, and of course to our sponsors who helped make this event possible. Just want to remind everybody that this workshop is being recorded, and at the end of the workshop, you're going to see an evaluation pop up. It only takes a couple of seconds, but if you want to provide some feedback on this workshop at the conference overall, really helps us improve and prepare for next year's conference. And then last but not least, you've got a little chat bar in the side of your screen. And if you've got questions, comments, feel free to use that. But without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Jamie, who's going to kick us off today. And thank all for being here.
Thanks, Evan. Yeah, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. We're really excited to have you here and really excited for this conversation. You know, land conservation and land trusts in California are certainly a heavy topic and an exciting one. I'm excited to have all of these speakers here. But you know, as we'll wait like another minute or so. I know that folks trickle in a little bit late, but you know, as we're getting started, please, you know, introduce yourself in the chat. Drop your name, title, pronouns, land acknowledgement, like identify, you know, what lands you're on. And really, this is important to us to see who's in the room. That'll really shape the kinds of responses to the questions we have and make sure that we're kind of speaking to you, to who's on the audience. So if you're a farmer or if you're a land steward or you work with a land trust, or please, you know, drop your name and your and you know, however you want to share, you know, how you identify in this space. That would be really welcome. And then we'll kind of kick it off in just a few seconds here. We are waiting on one more of our panelists, but I think we can get started with just some like context setting and some framing. But you know, as we're going here, please add your name and such into the chat. But yeah, so sorry. Things are falling in my house. So yeah, as Evan mentioned, you know, my name is Jamie Fanous. I'm the senior policy advocate and organizer at CAFF, and I'll be moderating this session today. But before we get too into the details, I just want to extend a big thank you to Amah Torbert, who's here on the line, and I think trying to get Javier onto the call. Amah Torbert kind of introduced or created this session and invited all of these panelists here and did a lot of the legwork to organizing these sessions, and it's no small task. So just want to extend a thanks to Amah, who's here on the screen. And yeah, so and yeah, as we're going, please put some of your details into the chat. So just another reminder. But yeah, so the goal of this session is really to shine a light on land conservation efforts and the way in which this community, specifically land trusts in this case, can do better to center equity and support beginning farmers and BIPOC farm communities. Just for some background, we've got Javier. For some background,
hola,
Javier. We're just doing a little intro. Thanks for joining.
No problem.
But yeah, so just for some background, you know, California is home to more than 150 land trusts that have protected more than 2.5 million acres They are private nonprofits that protect land from development. They buy land or they buy certain rights to land, such as conservation easements that extinguishes the right to develop the property. Inequity is baked into the history and principles of private property. But land trusts do have the opportunity to address historic inequities, and as they make decisions about how to protect and steward land. So just want to kind of set that context for everyone around, this conversation around conservation of land and land trusts as we enter into the panel conversation. But yeah, so before we ask the panelists some questions, please, in addition to identifying yourself, thank you for those who have. Another, question, and I just want to highlight too, is just like, how are you coming to this issue? What connects you to land? And kind of highlighting to that piece, and I think a lot of folks are already answering this question, is, do you work for a land trust? Are you a beginning farmer looking for land? Are you a land steward? Are you passionate about conservation? Really just sharing what you, where you come from as we're entering this conversation about land. And I'm seeing a lot of folks that are focusing on small space design and urban farming, urban farmers, and centering in immigrant communities. This is really great. Yeah, community land trusts. Thanks to those who have shared so far, and I'll keep an eye on the chat as we continue. But yeah, so I'm just gonna jump in. I'm gonna allow our panelists to kind of introduce themselves as we jump into this first question, because all of them have these incredible titles and bios and are so leaders in this space, and so could probably spend like an hour just talking about all of the work that each of these folks do. So I'm just going to let them highlight what they want to in this introduction, in this introductory question. So so to our panelists, what role, of course, as I mentioned, take a moment to introduce yourself as you answer this question of what role do land trusts play in your work and or community, and what has been your experience with the interconnection between land conservation, land trusts, and equity? Maybe we can start with Javier.
Oh, wow, I'm the lucky one. Well, thank you for inviting me to participate. I think this is such an excellent topic and subject that I really think that a lot of people take things for granted, and not knowing that their food has a lot to do with who's farming it and where it's being grown. And some of the I'll give you a little couple of minutes about my life. I mean, I'm obviously the growing crops and food for me comes in my family. I'm a second generation farmer, first in America. First or second, because my father and some siblings in Mexico are farmers. But I'm really blessed that I've been able to now paying or owning a piece of land with the help of the Elkhorn Slough Foundation here in Monterey County, Santa Cruz County. I believe that independent farmers or small beginning farmers have such a hard time having access to land that it's in some corporations and some bigger money's hands, and doesn't really allow a small farmer to own a piece of land. No one is really making a piece of land anymore. So organizations like the Land Trust and conservation organizations that have in mind sharing some of the land that can be farmable, along with land that it's been in conservation. It's an excellent way for us to help our communities and help our communities to have access to food closer to where it's needed. So in my case, and I don't want to take a long time, I mean, you can read about my bio. If you just Google JSM Organics or Javier Zamora, you'll find a lot about me and how blessed I am and how difficult it has been as well to really get to the point where we are. So now, besides making our farm on a running business on a daily basis, I take a lot of pride on participating in webinars like this or conferences where I can share my experience and my challenges that I faced the last 10, 15 years to get to where I am now. But thank you so much, and I'm so happy to see some faces that I have not seen for a while. Hola, Kendra, ¿cómo estás? And Señor Bryan, hola. It's so happy to be with you guys and to see you. Muchas gracias.
Thanks, Javier. Why don't we hand it to Bryan next?
Sure, thanks very much, and wonderful to see you, Javier, and thank you everyone for joining our conversation today. My name is Bryan Largay. I work for the Land Trust of Santa Cruz County. We're an organization, a private nonprofit organization, as are all land trusts. We've been around since 1978, and I'll tell you a little bit about how our organization works. But what's important to realize is that each land trust is its own individual organization. In California, at least, they are private nonprofit organizations, and that's how they are in many parts of the country. There are some towns that have town land trusts in the Northeast, and those sometimes are public-private partnership organizations. But what I'm most familiar with are private nonprofits like the organization that I work for. And since these organizations are private entities, their mission and how they approach it is defined by their board of directors. Our organization has a big tent philosophy to land conservation, which is to say we are enthusiastic about keeping natural and working lands in a natural or working land condition, and preventing widespread sprawl of industrial uses or residential uses of land, and trying to keep those types of uses focused around cities so that the natural and working lands can provide benefits for biodiversity or water resources or food production or timber production. And that's our top priority. There are other land trusts that may solely have a focus on working lands. Some might only have a focus on row crop agriculture. Some might have a focus on grazing lands. Some might have a focus on lands related to biodiversity. Some might have a focus on lands related to public access and connecting people to the outdoors. Each land trust is a little bit different in that way. And so if you're seeking partnerships with land trusts, if you go to their webpage and look at their mission statement, you'll get a sense of how they approach the topic of farmland conservation. What land trusts have in common is they have a toolkit related to land ownership and to a certain extent management. There are two main ways land trusts own land. Sometimes they own the land outright and own it just like any other private property owner does, and then they can use that land as they see fit. In the case of farmland, we have a property that's a working farm and we lease the land out to growers the same way a lot of the land in our area is leased to growers. And I can describe that more later if there are questions about it. The other main tool we have are conservation easements. And this is where the land, we have purchased the rights to develop the property for a residential or industrial use. And generally speaking, we've extinguished that right. So that is no longer an option to whoever owns the land. And then that land is then owned not by the land trust, it's owned by another individual or an entity, and they can do with it as they will, provided they're consistent with the conservation easement. And the conservation easement usually says things like, the only thing you can do with this land is use it for agriculture. That reduces the value of the property in some cases substantially because it can't be used for residential home site development or industrial uses. In other cases, it doesn't reduce the value of the property very much because maybe that land was already protected if it was in the coastal zone or zoned for very large lots. So sometimes the easement is worth just 10% of the property value. Sometimes it could be worth 90% of the property value. And what we do is that sometimes we will buy the conservation easement, sometimes with grant funding from the state of California or a foundation. And sometimes landowners will donate the easement to us, and then they will realize a tax benefit as a charitable contribution. And then our job with these easements is to visit the property every year and make sure they're not being used in a way that's inconsistent with the easement. And if they are, then we can enforce our right to the easement. And for example, if they built a warehouse in a place they're not supposed to, we could take them to court if we had to remove the warehouse and restore the land to being farmland. So that's just a quick overview of what we do and how we do it. And I'm happy to get into more of those details later on.
Thanks, Bryan. Let's hand it over to Chairman Lopez now, the Amah Mutsun tribal band. You're muted, Chairman.
Thank you, Jamie. I need more training on how to use Zoom, I think. Excellent background, Bryan. You know, you gave a really good overview of land trust and stuff like that. My name is Valentine Lopez. I'm the chairman of the Amah Mutsun tribal band. Our tribe is comprised of the descendants of those that were taken to missions San Juan Bautista and mission Santa Cruz. We were removed from our tribal lands many years ago, and because of the cost of our lands, we cannot, very few members live within our traditional territory. In 2006, elders came to a council meeting and they said that we need to, you know, the Creator gave us a responsibility to take care of the lands of our territory. And we need to get back to that. And that seemed like an impossible task because, you know, we are a very poor tribe. We're not federally recognized. So we get assistance. We do not get assistance from the state, from the federal, from any program out there. We do not get any assistance at all. And so we didn't understand how we were going to get back to our territory. And so what we did, what our tribe has always done, we prayed and we asked Creator to help us find a way back. And it wasn't long after that, we got a call first from Pinnacles National Park to come on in and talk to them about, collaborating and talking about how to take care of the cultural resources that were there, and talk about, a lot of the interpretation of that park, the indigenous history of that park, etc. And then from there, state parks invited us in, and then we got in, there along the way, we got introduced to a lot of other a land trust, open space districts, the Bureau of Land Management, for example, and others. And we developed MOUs with many of those, and those MOUs allow us access for for stewardship, for ceremony, for gatherings, for education, for research, etc. So all that Bryan talked about land trust, owning lands and stuff like that. Our land trust emphasizes stewardship, traditional native stewardship of the lands. We do not emphasize, the ownership, etc. And a goal for our stewardship is to restore the native plants in their natural, in the territories where they existed before first contact. That's where our research program comes in. We can do research of the lands and tell you what plants were there pre-contact and what that landscape looked like before the colonizers arrived. And then we work hard to restore those lands to the traditional territory. Today, our tribe has access to over 140,000 acres within our traditional territory. And our land trust doesn't own not 1 inch of land. So we're a land trust without land. You say, man, you guys aren't very good, are you? And if you look at it from an ownership standpoint, that's true. We're not very good. But if you look at it from an indigenous standpoint, our ancestors didn't own the land either. They recognized that land belonged to Creator. And believe it or not, that land still belongs to Creator. The people that own it today are just saying it's theirs, and someday they'll find out that it belongs to Creator. We don't use the word farming or agriculture. This is a small farms conference, and we don't use that word farm. We don't use the word agriculture. That connotes you're dominating the plants. You're telling the plants enforcing them to do what you want them to do. And in our culture, we don't do that. So I wanted to mention that we don't use those terms. We call it managing traditional cultural resources. When we look at the native plants and stuff like that, we recognize that as our foods, our medicines, our basketry, our materials for baby care, women's care, for netting, for all the different purposes, the housing, the clothing, etc. That's what they represent to us. And so we want to restore them in a natural environment. And then we want to restore the traditional stewardship, and we want to restore, bring them back into our, bring the foods back into our diet, start using our medicines in the traditional way, etc. And I'm looking forward to talking more at this conference, because in all honesty, a lot of our traditional stewardship ways and stuff like that are being recognized as ways that we must restore, that we must get back to and stewarding these lands in the traditional ways of our ancestors if we're going to deal with climate change, and if we're going to survive that next period of time, that hard period of time that's coming at us. And so I look forward to talking about that. Regarding the interconnection with other land trusts, we have good relationships with the land trust, because we don't, we work with other land trusts. We work with the land trust in Santa Cruz County, for example. We're very happy of that relationship. And they give us access to important lands that are within our traditional tribal territory. And we're working to try to restore basketry materials there, for example. That's very important for our, for our basketry traditions, etc. And restoring traditional stewardship to the waterways at the Watsonville sloughs. There's 5 sloughs in Watsonville, and we're looking to restore those. So the interconnection between land trusts, we have those kinds of relationships with many land trusts, and they allow us access to those, to their lands. And the interconnection to equity, you know, for our tribe, and we were removed from these lands, completely removed from these lands. You know, and a really important part of our thing is a relationship. You know, we see Mother Earth as being, we recognize Mother Earth as being very sacred, and we have a responsibility to restore that sacredness and to maintain that sacredness on the lands. And so, you know, and that's a big part of what we do on the lands. And so, and then we invite all people to come on in and work and learn with us about the traditional knowledge, as that's going to be so important for us to go forward. Our food plants are, all of our food plants can be, you know, can and should be grown the way, in the traditional way. That's the way we see it. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. So that's a brief overview of what we do. And thank you.
Thanks, Chairman Lopez. And finally, we'll hand it to Kendra. Take it away.
Hi, everyone. It's really nice to see you all who are here. I hope this is the beginning of more conversation. And thank you, Chairman Lopez, for you always frame things in such an important and challenging way. And so I want to really acknowledge your perspective, both on land care versus ownership, and also on what agriculture and farming mean. As someone that's about to use those words about 50 times in my coming introductory remarks, I think it's really important to continue to ask ourselves what that means. So I'm from the ancestral territory of the Kashaya Pomo, born and raised there. And after several stints in the Midwest for study and the all around the world, then in the Bay Area, I farmed for a number of years on an annual crop share agreement, I will say, as well as working and studying in the Central Valley. I'm now back on Southern Pomo ancestral lands with my family. While I was in the Central Valley, I spent a number of years on staff and later on the board of California FarmLink, which I think is where I learned the most about this intersection between land tenure and conservation. It was my time working with farmers and landowners at FarmLink where I really saw why land tenure is consistently named as one of the very top barriers that farmers face to getting started or to succeeding. I saw firsthand why farmers struggle so hard to pass their businesses and land down to the next generation, why we are in a national farm succession crisis, truly. Because whether they be children or heirs, farm employees, or other new entry farmers, the gap between retiring farmers' healthcare and retirement needs and the cost of entry for the new incoming farmer just is not being filled. It's not fillable right now. I read recently that over half of the nation's farmland owners are over 75 years old. One of the problems is affordability. Again, this has already come up today. Farmers that don't come from landowning families have no hope of buying land on agricultural incomes. Net per acre farm incomes have been decreasing steadily for quite some time, even while net farm land prices are increasing steadily over time. A young farmer I worked with a number of years ago just explained the irony very succinctly when she said, look, I could own some farmland, but then I'd have to go get a job and I wouldn't be farming. Or I could follow my dreams and my passion and my experience and become a farmer and forget ever affording to own land myself. So what are some of the alternatives? Stewardship is another issue that comes up. Scale and tenure both affect our ability to care for land. If ag land is at the foundation of our food system and there's a limited amount of it, what do we do to invite small and mid-scale producers to have enough security to invest in our regional food systems and in good land care. The last kind of piece of this puzzle that I'm still learning about to this day is injustice in land. 98% of U.S. farmland is white owned. Upwards of, I'd say, easily 70% or more of all the people growing food in California are Latinx, right? Latinx farmers are also the fastest growing sector of new entry farmers for such important reasons in this next cohort of beginning farmers in this country. And yet land ownership by that sector, land control of land in any form is really, really minuscule. So all this time with FarmLink, I began to be interested in the farmland conservation movement and how land trusts like Bryan's are working to protect land, and so importantly from development, but again using these private property tools, which are important tools that we have at our disposal. So how do we both protect land from development, but also go a step farther and make sure that ag lands remain in the hands of working farmers? And that was became the focus of my master's work, and something that I've been working on with land trusts and farmer advocacy organizations for about 15 years now. So currently, I'm delighted to be working with Agrarian Trust, which is innovating a new model of community land ownership called the Agrarian Commons, and we'll be talking a little bit more about that. Sorry.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Yeah, I feel like I've learned a whole lot just in the last 15 minutes. Yeah, with that, I'm gonna jump into our next question. And the second round of questions, this one is you know, I'm gonna start with Javier and Chairman Lopez, and a separate question for Kendra and Bryan. But yeah, when we first met as a panel a few weeks back, you know, Chairman Lopez highlighted some of the incredible work that the Amah Mutsun Land Trust has highlighted around kind of centering traditional knowledge when we think about conservation and reintroducing native plants to land. And kind of on that vein of thought too, thinking about climate change as mentioned earlier. So this question is, you know, what are the possibilities for land trust or conservation organizations to center traditional land stewardship or cultural practice, really wanting to speak to the critical importance of kind of incorporating traditional knowledge and culturally appropriate knowledge into the way we think about land conservation and stewardship. So I can hand it over to Javier to answer first. And let me know if I should repeat the question.
Yes, well, I'm a simple guy, and sometimes I have a really question answer. I mean, difficult time trying to answer such a diverse and big question on how you guys word it. Sometimes I'm just a plain guy that sometimes I'm trying to figure out exactly what the question is. But I first like to say that, Chairman, I think it's really for me an honor to participate and on such a panel like this, because some of the words that you were saying are so deeply engraved in my heart and my brain that sometimes I talk about this beautiful land behind me, and I'm blessed to have the honor of being the steward and for some time in this life. I don't know how many years, but it's just a piece of land that it's been here for generations that are maybe a little closer to you than to me, that I come from other land far away, but I've landed here and I've been given the opportunity and the honor to treat it in a way that can honor your or our past relatives, and I've been given the opportunity to keep it in really good shape and maybe even get it back or bring it back to its original situation. And the way I farm, or the way I'm benefiting, and I'm trying to incorporate practices of producing food and growing food for our communities in a way that that does not harm our soil, our waterways, and our riparian areas that are surrounded by those pieces of land that we're using to grow food for our community. So I deeply appreciate your words, and they're in my head when I'm farming and how I'm treating the land. So I feel really blessed to be working with, an organization, a nonprofit like the Elkhorn Slough Foundation that has the vision of preserving land for future generations and treating our natural resources in a way that will stay here and benefit future generations. So for someone, an immigrant like myself, a land trust of a conservation organization is giving the opportunity to maintain a more balanced ecosystem. So in my case, when I was presented with the opportunity to get ownership of this land with the help of the Elkhorn Slough Foundation, it's been nothing but a blessing, because this ranch is 200 acres, but 125 are part of a conservation easement. So all I need is those 75 that can be farmed and can make such a great impact. And when they contributed, a large amount of dollar bills to make this possible, for me to own it and for them to put most of it in conservation, it just shows that getting involved in a community way can make a big difference and can bring us back to better ways of society balance, if you will. So I would say, I hope I'm trying to respond to the so complicated question that Jamie had, but
You're answering it perfectly, Javier. Absolutely perfectly.
I think we need this. We need more of the land trust and more of the non-profit and maybe some private money that sometimes have a hard time figuring out what to do with some assets that they have. So this would be a really good way for those sometimes Silicon Valley money that are trying to figure out how can I give back to the contributors, if you will, of my wealth, so that we can make communities better. So a land trust of a conservation easement on properties that can be farmed and at the same time preserved for future generations is such a great asset for our communities. And it gives beginning farmers, and especially farmers of color, Latinos or Latinx, as they say now, or BIPOC, and all these other names that you guys are coming up with, which I respect, an opportunity to carry out our dreams of producing food and maybe having control of some land where it gives us the stability to let our creativity go without having to worry of giving it back in 11 or 12 months every single season. Muchas gracias.
Thanks, Javier. And I'll hand it over to Chairman Lopez next.
Thank you for that response, Javier. And you know, I'm going to kind of get into the nuts and bolts. You know, the question is, you know, what are the possibilities for land trusts or conservation organizations to center traditional land stewardship? You know, I mean, it's not a possibility. I mean, it's imperative. It is imperative from my perspective that we restore traditional stewardship back to the lands. And here's what that means. Number one is restoring the sacredness back to the lands. I know whenever we work side by side with the CCC, we work side by side with state at times, you know, not a lot of work with the CCC, but we have worked with them, with state parks, with RCDs and with others. But we always start in the morning prayer. We always start our morning work with a prayer and an offering. The Creator will watch over us and you know, and appreciate our work and talk about why we did it, why we do that, and to thank Creator for the opportunity to do that. You know, and now the people that we work with in state parks, no matter where they're at in state parks, every morning they start their day with a prayer and with an offering. And the same for many of those other organizations. That's how they're starting their prayer, their work day. And so, you know, everyone here who's interested in doing that, I mean, you know, we believe that they should start each day, you know, with a prayer and an offering. Here's the, you know, the concept of plants. You know, it's our, you know, we know that all plants are a gift to us from Creator. They are a gift. And then all plants have an enormous responsibility for a full community. You know, now the way a lot of the plants are grown, they're grown just as a food crop, period. It's not recognized that they have so much more responsibility to a community than just a food plant. Those food plants have a responsibility to the fungi, to the birds, to the four-legged, to the insects, and to people. Those plants have that responsibility. But now, I mean, in the commercial agriculture, for example, there's a fungi, they're going to spray a fungicide. If there's insects there, they're going to spray an insecticide. You know, if there's birds there, they're going to put off these charges to scare the birds away, or put nets over it, all other kinds of ideas to keep the birds out of it. You know, if there's four-legged, they're going to put a fence around it or come up with some system for keeping the four-legged out of those plants. And or fencing. I mean, I know recently I've just seen fencing going up, you know, and but those plants are creatures of Creator as well, and they have a responsibility to them. But yet when they just plant the food plants, they're not taking care of any of that community. Those plants can't do it, can't, you know, don't have, you know, are not able to provide for that. But the way that we managed those plants and understood those plants, as a result of that, they developed very deep root systems. A lot of our grasslands, for example, they'll develop root systems that go down 15 or 20 feet deep. Our plants grow a lot slower than the non-native plants because they have that responsibility to that full community. But that deep root system, they're much more resistant to fire, to flood, to drought. And they require much less water because of that deep root system. And that's important to know that, because they have a deep root system and they grow slower, that's part of what happened to our plants. Because whenever, our plant, they thought our grazing grasses were inferior to the European grasses, partially because they grew too slow, and they didn't, and they knew the European grasses grew faster, so they thought that was better. They bring them in, and those plants that took off like that, they grew fast. They just quickly shaded out all the native plants. They quickly shaded out our native plants, but those non-native plants, they come in and they develop root systems. Some of them 6-8 inches deep, and that's it. Whenever you drive by in the mountains, after the passing of spring, you look in the mountains and you see green plants up there, and then you see the rest of the hill is all dry and brown. That's because those green plants are our native plants that are there. So that deep root system is very important. Also the disease. Our native plants are much more resistant to disease. An example of that is that in the 1960s, there was a disease affecting the vineyards. It started in France, and then it quickly went around the world. And everybody saw that as an absolute disaster. There wasn't going to be any more wine. What were people going to do now? And so, they had brought a lot of scientists and a lot of people in, but how they solved that problem is they learned that the root system of the California grape was resistant to that disease. And so now vineyards, commercial vineyards around the world, the vast majority, if not all of them, have the rootstock from the California grape. And that same story is true of all the strawberry fields and farms around the world. The California strawberry is a rootstock, is an important component of that rootstock. And the same for many of the nut crops, and the same is true for many of the other plants. Those are all really important. The other thing is the way, we had the system where we took care, of the plants. The way that we took care of the plants, provided for great biodiversity. I mean, we have plants for the butterflies. We have plants for hummingbirds. We have plants for bees. We have plants for, all the wildlife. We have them identified, which of those, which insects and which four-legged, et cetera. Those plants, we have, those plants have a responsibility to that full community. But, and so that needs to be part of the bigger overall picture of what we're doing. So those are just some things that are important that we need to look at when we talk about, bringing in traditional land stewardship to farming. How can that be accomplished? And that doesn't mean you got to let the bees and the insects come into your plants, but you can put aside 10, 20%.
Yep.
Let's take care of the 10%, the perimeters and stuff like that. That's how some farmers are approaching that. So those are just some ideas I thought I'd share with you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Chairman Lopez. There's so many examples of, the rootstock example is just, really compelling to hear, and something that not many people in agriculture know about. So thank you both. So this next question is for Kendra and Bryan, and maybe we could start with Bryan. Is can you speak to the avenues of opportunity and barriers for land trusts, and maybe within that answer, highlight how the history of land trusts really relate to some of these barriers, since I'm sure you could speak to it quite well. So we can start with you, Bryan.
So I'm going to try to speak to what I perceive to be barriers to entry for small farmers trying to gain access to land, as opposed to barriers to land trusts to protecting land, just because I think that's more the interest of the group. So I'm just going to try to explain the context that we work in, and then use that to highlight a few examples of where that might not provide the support a small land seeking person might wish they got out of the deal. So the mission of my land trust, as I described, is this big tent conservation. So we try to protect land because of its working land value, because of we might protect the same or different land because of biodiversity. We might protect other land for public access trails. And so each land has its own value. And for our agricultural conservation program, the single most important value we focus on is that the land stays a productive working land. And that's in some ways, getting that done takes a lot of work. From the perspective of some individuals or organizations, that might be a pretty low bar. However, some people might, and some organizations might prioritize protecting farmland expressly so it can be available to small farmers, or for the purpose of making that farmland organic, or some for the purpose of retiring the farmland altogether and restoring it to wetlands or floodplain habitat. And so there's different land trusts will look at the situation differently. And our area, the Pajaro Valley of Santa Cruz County and North Monterey County, is enormously productive, grows very healthy food, supports thousands and thousands of jobs. And our top priority is to make sure that our agricultural region stays an agricultural region and doesn't switch the way the Santa Clara Valley did into an urbanized area. And so that's our #1 priority. And that the most efficient way for us to achieve that goal is to do conservation easements that strip the development rights from the land on large, intact pieces of farmland. So for example, if we can do a farmland conservation project on 100 acres of farmland, that's a really big farm in our area. Just for a sense of scale, a 100-acre farm would cost the grower $3 million in inputs to produce the strawberry crop or the vegetable crops that would come off that land. And so a 100-acre farm is a big deal. 100-acre farm to purchase outright would probably cost $5 or $6 million. So that's a big piece of land. When we buy a conservation easement on it, it now can't be developed for that purpose. It turns out the land is so valuable as farmland, the easement is only worth 10% typically of the land value. So let's say that land cost $5 million before the easement. After the easement, it still costs $4.5 million. And obviously that is well out of reach of many small farmers. Furthermore, because the land is protected as a 100-acre block with perhaps one home site, it now can't be used for a number of small growers very easily who might want to live on the property where they farm. And so that type of a conservation project achieves our goal of making sure we keep ag land in ag very efficiently. But it prevents the future subdivision of that land into, say, 5 20-acre farms, each with its own home site. And so that can, I think there are certainly some people who would say that that type of a project works against the interest of small growers. At the same time, it very efficiently protects this land and makes sure that you don't end up with 5 20-acre ranchettes with big lawns and a tomato patch that someone calls a farm, but isn't really a farm. And so these things are complicated, lots of details, and the challenge is in the details. One project we did recently that we're quite proud of is a collaboration with Dirt Capital, where we protected a large farm piece of property where they purchased it. We purchased a conservation easement from them to prevent the future development. And now they're going to lease the property to a number of small growers trying to make the leap from farm worker to grower. And they'll be able to lease the land at a subsidy to accomplish those goals. For better, for worse, what they won't be able to do is have their homestead on that same property. And so they'll have to commute out to their ranch from a nearby town where there's housing available. So at any rate, it's pretty, there's a lot of trickiness in those details. Could we have done a project that allowed for smaller parcels? Perhaps. We secured some grant funding from the state of California for that purpose, and their grant templates through the Department of Conservation, their easement templates, do not allow for subdivision. So there too is a state program that prevents, where one of the core approaches to protecting farmland is to prevent subdivision of parcels. And that probably does keep the land in farming, but it might make it hard to access until you have enough capital to buy a pretty big chunk of land. We also own a ranch that we lease to growers. It has 240 acres of strawberries and vegetables. It's over near Pajaro Valley High School. We're actually going to make it open to the public in a few years for community agricultural access with some community orchards and things like that. Hopefully you can come and visit. Those lands are available for lease on the open market, where we announced that we're seeking tenants and lease the land out to those growers. We have 5 different growers. The smallest operates on 1 acre, and the largest operates on 150 acres. And as you can imagine, we have several in between. And in that instance, we give a rent reduction, because we have a lot of habitat restoration near the farms, and we require cover crops for soil conservation in the winter. And so we give our growers about a 30% discount below market rate for rent. But the grower who rents 150 acres is a pretty big operator. The grower who rents 1 acre is a really small operator, and we charge them all the same amount. So we don't expressly have a small grower support program or subsidy program on our ranch.
Yeah, thanks, Bryan. And we'll hand it over to Kendra to close us out, and then we'll leave a bit of time at the end for some Q&A. I know there's a lot of questions here in the Q&A, so we'll do our best to get to some of them.
That was such a great story, Bryan, about one particular land trust in one very important agricultural region doing the work that you're doing. And thanks for the framing. This is hard stuff to figure out. As Bryan said, easements are they're the most permanent tool we have to protect land from subdivision or development right now. But the agricultural land conservation movement started here with Marin Agricultural Land Trust only 40 years ago, and was built on the shoulders of the conservation movement before that and land protection movement. I think all of the land trusts working on agricultural land protection are beginning to recognize the limitations of easements in some way, and really think about this larger picture. So again, because easements are designed to prevent subdivision and development, traditional conservation easements can't guarantee that land will stay in production. In an ag region like Bryan's, that is such a that is the going use of land, and agriculture is relatively lucrative there. So it's going to stay in ag most likely when it's protected for such. But as Bryan pointed out, ag lands all over, protected or not, are selling to non-farmers for sometimes agricultural uses and sometimes slipping out of those uses into others. It also is not possible, given traditional easement tools, to ensure that lands remain affordable to working farmers. There are some enhanced easement provisions, we like to call them, regularly used on the East Coast that are trying to address both of these things. In one case, by requiring an affirmative ag use, we call it affirmative language sometimes, or mandatory ag use. And also using a tool called the option to purchase at ag value, where a land trust can actually own this real estate option, which allows it to step in upon transfer of that land and make sure that the price of that land stays at an affordable rate for the next buyer, who in that case would have to be a qualifying farmer. In California, we're not using these tools very much yet. In the Cape Valley, I worked on a campaign called One Farm at a Time with a group of food co-ops, community members, and the CSA members of a 20-acre diversified organic farm called Good Humus, to protect that farm using pretty unusual easement tools, including affirmative requirement, the requirement that the farmer be the owner and live on the land, as well as an option to purchase at ag value that greatly restricts the value of that land for resale to intended new next generation farmers. And that land is now being farmed by the kids of the farmers that placed the easement on that property, who saw that they weren't going to be able to stay on their childhood home if they didn't get into farming, and they were totally up for it and doing a beautiful job. But again, what is it that the ag land protection movement can learn? 40 years of ag conservation easements, and yet 50 years ago, New Communities Land Trust was formed to protect the civil rights, culture, and food system and affordable housing of a Black community in Southwest Georgia. Community land trusts have now become one of the most important affordable housing models in the nation. And yet these two kind of conservation movements have been acting largely in parallel for decades and decades. It would take until recently, I think, for several activists and thinkers to really begin to recognize the importance of social equity and community values, in addition to natural resource and ecosystem values on this land that we've been trying so hard to protect. So it's that kind of nexus inspired by New Communities. Let's see, how am I doing on time, Jamie? 12, okay. As well as a movement in France, Terre de Liens, as a movement in India, others around the world that inspired the Agrarian Trust, with the help of the Sustainable Economies Law Center here in Oakland, to adapt a new community land trust model under an agrarian land trust to kind of hybridize the two. What this does is takes farmland off the market permanently and conveys long-term equitable tenure to working farmers. The Agrarian Commons, these smaller community land trust entities under the national umbrella, are governed by local boards with a required representation of leasing farmers, community members, and Agrarian Trust staff. So again, the smaller regional community land trusts, or Agrarian Commons, are then legally supported under and supported in other ways under this national umbrella, the Agrarian Trust. So now the Agrarian Trust has helped to launch what are now, I think, 13 Agrarian Commons around the country, including important lands protected for a Somali Bantu community nonprofit in Maine, a Black-owned peri-urban farm in Southwest Virginia, a white-owned grass-fed livestock farm in New Hampshire, community farm transforming Virginia coal country, a Black-led educational center on Whidbey Island, an Indigenous collective in Massachusetts, and other land projects underway. What these farms have in common, because there's a lot they don't, is that they've secured a foundation for equitable community-based reconnection to land in those places. So we'll have some more time in Q&A, but thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and I always after hearing a lot of what's been said, it always just takes me back to like thinking or going deeper and deeper into like questioning what we consider ownership, and if that's the right direction in terms of thinking about how to properly steward and care for our land. There is a wealth of questions in the Q&A, and thank you, Bryan, for starting to answer some of those. If folks haven't had a chance and have similar questions, please check out, how Bryan, some of the responses Bryan's provided. So with some of these questions, I think I'm going to just target specific individuals, and I don't know if we'll be able to get to everyone. But this first question, and maybe Bryan, you're the most appropriate to answer this, is from Carrie. How do you find your land seekers? Do you do RFPs? I'm looking at other ways more equitably that land trusts and county agencies can find the right farmer and land steward.
Sure. In our instance, we recruited tenants through a variety of means. We posted on the bulletin board at Eco Farm, which is a global conference, but it happened to be 20 miles from our ranch, so that was convenient. We advertised in the local paper, the local Farm Bureau newsletter, and lots of word of mouth. I don't know about how it's done in typical contexts. It is an interesting question, especially as more agencies own land. In our area, for example, state parks has hundreds of acres of farmland that are leased out. I don't know the circumstances under which they revisit their tenant agreements or consider whether to renew the lease or open it to the market. So it's an interesting question. As I mentioned before, though, we just did ours based on an open solicitation without targeting a particular demographic of grower.
Great, thanks, Bryan. This next question is for you, Chairman Lopez, from Layla, regarding what you were mentioning earlier about around larger that kind of bring up larger cultural and systemic shifts that need to happen. And she's curious how land trust can play a role in this. It seems there needs to be buy-in from landholders for these greater changes to take place. I don't know if you have any reflections or thoughts on that. It's okay if you don't. You're muted, by the way. Chairman, you're muted.
No, I was saying that was a trick question. How can land trust, our relationship with the land trust in Santa Cruz County, for example, that's a good way. They allow us access to a lot of lands that are important to us. They allow us to hold ceremony there on those lands. They allow us to bring back traditional stewardship. And so that's one thing that comes to mind that's important. The other thing is recognize that our traditional approaches, we had an issue a while back, and it tied into, we were on lands in San Mateo County, and there was an agricultural easement there, and then we made the argument that our traditional land stewardship and taking care of our native plants qualifies for an agricultural easement, meets the criteria, cultural easement criteria, or however that goes. And they agreed. And, and so now, we haven't had the opportunity to introduce that concept, get approval by other counties and stuff like that. But, we do plan on seeking that at some point in the future. And that'll be important. Tell me that question again, Jamie, please.
I already, I think do I still have it access? Really just, I think if I were to interpret it, it's a lot around just, a lot of what needs to be done are these cultural and systemic shifts, and how we think about land and how we do a better job as a community, to center tribal communities, center a lot of the cultural components to what needs to be done, and it's just how, and I think you spoke to it, like how do land trusts help with this systemic shift, and as well as landholders, and how do we essentially influence our communities to start taking priority or start centering our tribal communities and our communities of color when we think about land. But I think you covered it, unless you have another closing thought.
Here's a couple things. Is for the there is a conservation easement, but we also have a cultural easement that we've introduced and that we hold at a couple places now. Well, we're going to be developing another cultural easement on a land partnership that we have with the Land Trust of Santa Cruz County at a property called the Nyland Ranch. We will be holding, developing a cultural easement there. But how the cultural easement differs from a conservation easement is that the main purpose for that easement is to restore the cultural landscape that existed before first contact. And so that kind of agreement that we have going on with Land Trust of Santa Cruz County and also San Benito County Land Trust, it is something that, it's going to be a new way of looking at it.
Yeah.
They have ranching there now. They have cattle there now, but we're, part of that right there is we're going to restore the cultural, particular areas of that back with native plants. Right. And, and so that's one way.
Yeah.
Another thing I wanted to say.
And I apologize. We have about 1 minute left.
Oh, go, please. I'm sorry.
No, I just wanted to spend the couple seconds we have to just thank you all for your time and knowledge and just being willing to share that in the space. And before we head out, if folks, I don't know if panelists if we were able to cover all of the questions, but if you'd like to drop your contact information in the chat, or I can share it with some of the folks that participated today to get some of those last questions answered, that would be great. But otherwise, yeah, just really grateful for the time. Thank you, everyone. And I hope folks continue to carry this conversation over and continue to talk to your local land trusts and start to make those shifts, ask those questions of your local land trust, and to start to make that systemic shift. So thank you all so much. And I hope to see everyone in other sessions at the conference.
Thank you all. And
Thank you, panelists. Thank you very much.
It was a
Adios.
pleasure. Good to see you all.